True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
In June of 1959, just 2 months before her 13th birthday, Lynne Harper was found dead in a wooded grove near a Clinton, Ontario Air Force Base. Lynne was small for her age, the middle child between two brothers. She was described as bossy and a real live wire, and she had her whole life ahead of her. Join us at the quiet end for two innocents. The last person seen with Lynne on the day she disappeared was 14-year-old classmate Steven Truscott. Despite a lack of any physical evidence and witness accounts which actually gave Steven a clear alibi, he was arrested for Lynne's murder just days after her body was found. So this is the story of Lynne's murder, of Steven's unjust conviction, the people who worked to free him and exonerate him of his murder conviction, and the continuing mystery of who was really responsible for this horrible murder.
So the beer for today is a nice Canadian beer. Probably one of my favorite beers ever, of all time. It's Pêche Mortelle, which is French for mortal sin, and it's brewed by Brasserie du Duciel, and it's brewed in Montreal, Quebec. So this is, again, one of my favorites. Truly sublime. Dark black, fairly thick mocha head that persists nicely. Strong, pleasant aroma of coffee. It has an espresso taste, a little burnt malt, and some sweet chocolate. A well-balanced, smooth beer. Creamy, even. I could drink this all night long.
But then would you still be conscious?
No, I'd be sleeping.
What's the alcohol content? You usually say that. Do you not know?
No, I know.
Oh, you're hiding it from me? What is it?
I don't remember.
Oh, okay. Well, usually you share that with us is the only reason I ask. I was just assuming that kind of a beer was high alcohol.
I think it's around 10%.
Yeah, I think it probably is in that direction. Okay, well, why don't we open it up and have some?
Good idea.
Okay. So I feel like this is a great beer for the holidays. It's cold outside, we've got the roaring fire, and it smells like chocolate coffee. Yum.
It's a wonderful beer.
It really is. So why don't we each have a glass and walk on down to the quiet end?
Yeah, the Sea of Santa's here.
There he is. I'm giving a little wave.
Yeah.
All right. I think Santa would be thrilled if you would buy him one of these.
Oh, I was thinking I would offer him some.
I think you should, in the holiday spirit.
Yeah, he's working hard.
Yeah, so after we record this, I think we might hang out with him a bit and, not get drunk, but get relaxed a little with this beer.
We'll do that.
All right, so why don't you start us out on this story? It's an older crime, but really fascinating to me.
This is an older crime.
One of the oldest, that we've done in a while.
We seem to be doing a few of these lately.
I find them fascinating.
Well, it's just interesting to me in the era today of DNA testing and all the forensic abilities that we have, how people used to solve crimes.
Well, what really stands out to me is no cell phones. Because with the most recent cases, I'm amazed at what the police can find out from people's cell phones. As far as location, who you're talking to, even how fast you're walking or driving. Yeah. It's amazing.
It truly is.
So this is more like old-fashioned police work, and unfortunately, in this case, it doesn't work out too well.
No, but it wasn't well evaluated.
Not at all. It was one of these kind of tunnel vision type of deals.
Yeah, they settled on a suspect pretty quickly.
They did.
And there wasn't going to be anything that took them away from that course.
No, not at all. Nope. And it kind of reminds me of the Stephanie Crow case where her brother was railroaded with his two friends for her murder. Yeah. So it is kind of similar, but it's 30 or 40 years before that one.
Yes, this stems from 1959.
Yep.
So on Friday, June 5th in 1959, 12-year-old Lynne Harper attended a party at her classmate Lorraine Wood's house. Lynne had been excited when she was invited, and she had a lot of fun when she was there. Most of that was because Lorraine's parents were much more liberal than most of the other parents, and they played modern romantic dance songs for the kids to dance to. Steven Truscott was one of the cute boys at the party. They were dancing to the popular songs of the era. Connie Francis singing Lipstick on Your Collar. Paul Anka doing Lonely Boy. Brings back memories.
Well,
of course, you weren't around then.
No, it's before my time, but certainly we all know these songs, I think. At least those of us born before the year 2000 know a little bit about these songs.
Oh, those are classic hits.
Yeah, absolutely. So at just 5'3" tall and 100 pounds, Lynne had her 13th birthday coming up in just 2 months. She was in a combined grade 7 and 8 classroom, which meant that many of her classmates were 13 or even 14-year-olds. Lynne was intelligent and very outgoing, but maybe a bit awkward. And this isn't unusual for a 12-year-old at all.
Oh, no.
The chaplain at the military base just saw Lynne as this sweet kid who attended Sunday school and youth Bible class. Her Girl Guide leaders saw her as an energetic girl with leadership skills. But her friends saw another side of Lynne, and some believed Lynne was lonely. She was very self-conscious about a scar that she had on her lip from a childhood accident. And as kids often do, she saw it as a bigger deal than it actually was. So Lynne tried hard to fit in with the older teens on the night of that June 5th party. She didn't have a boyfriend, and she kept asking boys to dance. And Lynne was disappointed because her friend and sometime crush, George Archibald, wasn't paying much attention to her that night. He didn't even dance with her. So Lynne had her eye on one of George's buddies, a lanky athlete who was popular with most of the girls, 14-year-old Steven Truscott.
Steven was definitely one of the in crowd. He had light brown hair, hazel eyes, and a really cute smile. He was 5'8.5" tall and towered over the other kids. It also happened that he was a skilled athlete. When the school's football team took the championship in late November 1958, the local paper ran a picture of the players, and Steven Truscott was identified as the star of the team. And all the girls on the base that were his age saw Steven as a friendly boy, someone you felt safe to be around.
So on that last Friday night of her life, Lynne walked up to Steven and she asked him to dance. He agreed out of politeness, but only danced for a couple of minutes. He then danced with Lorraine, and maybe he did this as a convenient escape from the younger girl. Not that Lynne was ugly or anything, but she's a 12-year-old, and that's a big deal when you're 14. That's a big age difference, just those 2 years.
Not going out with a baby. Right?
Right, and not that they ever really went out anyway. If someone was your boyfriend, you saw them at school, you might have talked on the phone.
Oh, yeah, particularly in this era.
Yeah. So Clinton is located in the farmlands of southern Ontario, about a 3-hour drive from Toronto. Most of the streets in the small community were named for Canada's provincial capitals. So riding on his bike, Steven could cover the entire neighborhood, from Halifax Road to Winnipeg Road to Victoria Boulevard and Quebec Road in less than 5 minutes. So that's pretty small. And the streets were never too busy with car traffic, so there were often tricycles, scooters, bikes, and kids on metal roller skates out and about. But the clutter of childhood was the only disorder that was really tolerated in Clinton. Residents had to keep their lawns trimmed and neat according to military regulations, or the station warrant officer would enforce it through the National Defense Act. Where you lived in Clinton really depended on what insignia your father wore on his uniform. Officers and their families lived in a separate neighborhood, segregated from the families of the lower ranks. The children didn't seem to separate friends according to this system, but the officers' children were definitely better off. They always had better clothes and they had more money to spend. So Lynne's family was one of these more privileged families. Their status confirmed by their proximity to the home of the base commanding officer. Tall trees in front and back of the 2-story house gave Lynne's family their own space and shade in the hot summer months. Lynne's dad, Leslie, 42 at the time, was a successful flying officer. He had been a teacher before joining the Air Force in January of 1940. He and his wife Shirley had 3 children before they moved to Clinton in July of 1957. 12-year-old Lynne, her 16-year-old brother Barry, and then little 5-year-old Jeffrey.
Lynne spent a good deal of time helping her mother, who had arthritis that made housework difficult. But Lynne sometimes just wanted to break free. Her home was orderly and quiet. She loved to hang out at her neighbor Yvonne's house, where their large family was busy, less organized, and laughed often. At the other end of the permanent military housing, past the spacious homes and tall trees on Victoria Boulevard, along Quebec Road's simpler houses, lived the Truscott family. Located near the local convenience store, their plain clapboard house had a small wooden porch, which was decorated with the kids' bikes and sports equipment. The aluminum screen door was always banging as the Truscott boys ran in and ran out.
Yes, Stephen lived with his parents and 3 siblings. His mom, Doris, was petite and very high energy. She cooked, cleaned, and did laundry for her very active family. Stephen's father, Dan, was a warrant officer, which was not a prominent rank. He was a fun, slightly chunky guy, and he was always willing to help organize family events and play with the local children. He was actually elected Man of the Year for doing the most for the welfare of young people on the base. So Dan Truscott was very well liked and very active in this small community. The local convenience store was a popular hangout for the kids, where they could buy soda pop and candy. When not at the store, Stephen could often be found right across the street from the school at the 150-acre farm that was owned by Bob Lawson. Lawson, age 22, was only a few years older than Stephen and some of the other teens, but his height of over 6 feet and his hard-working, no-nonsense personality made him seem much older to the children. They called him Farmer Lawson, and the children often stopped by to play with the animals or watch him do his chores. He seemed to enjoy their company for the most part. Stephen was a more frequent visitor to the farm than most of the children, partly because of his curiosity and partly because Bob Lawson just liked him. Stephen loved to help with the chores, and he was also a whiz at mechanics. He always seemed happy to help out. He also seemed a little more mature than the other kids. So Stephen was the only child Lawson ever let ride on his new Ferguson tractor. The two even put together some discarded transmissions and other auto parts with what was left of an old army truck, and they ended up making a pretty decent front-end loader. Stephen also enjoyed spending hours working with Lawson on his classic 1929 Model A Ford.
So this almost seems to me like a big brother-little brother relationship.
Yeah, but it also shows you that Stephen was well-liked and responsible and not a troublemaker at all.
No, he was a pretty good kid.
Yeah, he seemed like it.
Some children would play in a heavily wooded area at the northern edge of the farm occasionally, but the rough undergrowth and the mosquitoes made the woods inhospitable for any extended period of time, especially in the hot summer months. The woods could be fun to explore, but it was not this lover's lane that it was later made out to be.
No, and it will be made out that way. So Farmer Lawson had 40 head of cattle that year, and finding a helpless young calf was always a treat for the local kids. Cows about to give birth often looked for an isolated corner for privacy and protection. In late May, Stephen and his friend Leslie Spilsbury, that's a boy, found a young calf at the far end of Lawson's land, about a quarter of a mile from the road. The boys ran to show the farmer. Stephen and Leslie also once took their bikes to the edge of the bush and built a treehouse in the woods. So on the weekend of June 6 and 7, Stephen finished his farm chores and then had the rest of the time to fool around and go to a Saturday matinee. Every week the children crowded into the theater on the base, where a triple feature cost 10 cents. In the nice summer weather, however, most of their weekend fun was had outside. The school had play areas on all sides of the building, with a playground, swing sets, a football field, and a baseball diamond. So the school was the natural meeting point. An adventure out to the farm or to the river usually began and ended at the school.
Between Lawson's farm and the school, there's a 2-lane paved rural route known as the County Road. This road was the main artery linking the school play areas with the swimming hole in the Bayfield River. And it was about a mile north. So on any given summer afternoon in 1959, the county road would be crowded with bicycles, cars, pedestrians. Children were constantly walking or cycling up and down the road.
Well, from the school, it was a mostly downhill ride to the river, and a bike could pick up a lot of speed coasting down the road. About a half a mile in on the right-hand side of the road, there was a small tractor trail where you could turn off and head into Farmer Lawson's bush. If you continued past the laneway, you soon crossed the railway tracks and then the small concrete bridge over the Bayfield River. From the bridge, it was only a few hundred yards to busy Highway 8, and this was a major roadway. The bridge was a small cement structure with a short 40-inch wall on either side. Bikes, baseball mitts, and fishing gear would often be scattered around near the railing. About 600 feet east of the bridge, the river curved slightly where it formed a swimming hole where the children would play for hours at a time. Some of the more adventurous children traveled past the river, down to the intersection and up the busy highway where there was a small white house where an old recluse named Edgar Hodges kept a few ponies. The kids couldn't ride the ponies, but they liked to pet them or feed them apples. So this really was a carefree time when children thought nothing of wandering miles from their home and talking to strangers. Lynne and her friends occasionally would make the 2-mile walk to downtown Clinton. One friend, Catherine, would recall hitchhiking into town with Lynne to go shopping. And according to Catherine, it wasn't unusual for the kids to hitchhike back then. So that's important to remember as we go into the case, because a lot of people, especially the police, would say, oh, she would never have hitchhiked. But that doesn't seem to be true, because Catherine's not the only kid that said, sure, we hitchhiked.
Yeah. Well, on Monday, June 8th, which was the evening before she disappeared, Lynne went to one of her favorite activities, the Girl Guides. This was 3 days after the dance party at Lorraine Wood's house, and Lynne got into an argument with her friends about her having a crush on Steven Truscott. One of her friends, Andrea, had told another girl that Lynne had told her that she liked Steve. Well, Lynne confronted that girl, but she denied it. Now, at the Girl Guides meeting that evening, Lynne was assigned to hand out some prizes. Andrea wanted a red hairband, but Lynne kept it and gave Andrea a notebook instead. When Lynne woke up the next morning, she must have put the red band in her hair before heading off for school.
So on Tuesday, June 9th, the kids attended school on the Clinton Air Base. Maitland Edgar, the teacher for the combined 6th and 7th grade class, could barely keep his kids' minds on their work with the warm weather outside and less than 3 weeks before summer break. Edgar had actually been vice principal since 1951, but in this small 12-room country school, he also had to teach. He taught history, geography, English, and phys ed. So close to his desk, in the first seat of the middle row, was Lynne Harper's seat. And the teacher had put the 12-year-old there for a reason. Lynne was a real chatterbox. She was where Edgar could keep her under control. Her fellow students saw Lynne as a bit mouthy. She wasn't a bad kid. She was just one of those kids that always had their hand in the air to give the answers. In the last seat at the back of the classroom, at the end row next to the windows, is where Steven Truscott sat. Edgar found Steven to be an easygoing and responsible kid. Steven was average academically because sports were his real passion, not studies. And sitting near Steven was a more troublesome student, his friend Arnold Butch George. A strong and stocky boy, Butch had a reputation as a sometime fighter and a frequent fibber. Butch pushed to be the center of attention, and there were 2 obstacles that made him an outsider at the school. He was a native boy, and his father was an army man in an Air Force community.
And 3 seats away from Steven sat another outsider, desperate to be part of the crowd. Tall and thin, with a face pockmarked with acne and hair kept in dark ringlets, Jocelyn Gaudette was teased by the older girls. And unfortunately, Jocelyn's personality didn't help her. She was this kind of irritating, loud kid, and could be kind of forward, pushing herself on people. She liked to let on that she knew things, too, in order to get attention. So Vice Principal Edgar had some serious difficulties with both Jocelyn and Butch. Both of them had a general problem with telling the truth. There weren't any specific instances that really stood out, but they were considered untrustworthy. A few lies or exaggerations in school were an annoyance, but in a murder investigation, they could prove deadly.
So when the school bell rang that Tuesday afternoon, Lynne and Steven both ran off to play separate games of baseball. Neither knew that they would meet up later back at the school, and neither of them could know that one's life would end violently while the other's life would never be the same again. As a substitute player on the baseball team, Lynne played only 1 inning that day when her team played against the nearby town of Goderich. Still, she was thrilled when her team won. Helen Blair, a fourth-grade teacher and the coach, drove Lynne home afterwards. And during the drive, Lynne talked excitedly with the teacher about her favorite sport, which was swimming. When Lynne came through her front door, it was 5:30 p.m., and the rest of her family was almost finished with supper. Lynne's mom, Shirley, was just getting dessert when Lynne came in and sat down at the table. Shirley served her turkey skin and a 4-inch slice of meat. Then she put just a bit of warm dressing on her plate because Lynne didn't really like it. Then she added some peas and potatoes. If Lynne wanted something else, there was also bologna and ham in the fridge. And for dessert, Shirley had pineapple upside-down cake and 2 other kinds of cake, chocolate with coconut icing and orange chiffon. That's impressive to me.
Yeah, 3 desserts.
We never had dessert, and to think there were 3 cakes available? It would have to be like a holiday.
No kidding.
So her parents didn't stay at the table to watch Lynne eat. Instead, they took their tea and coffee into the living room. Lynne ate her meal in under 15 minutes, pretty much scarfing it down. It was 5:45 p.m., and she really wanted to go swimming, but not at the swimming hole, but at the pool on the base. A neighbor was taking her younger brother Jeffrey to the pool, but her mother had refused to ask the neighbor to take Lynne along. Shirley told her daughter, "I couldn't ask him to take my whole family." Shirley then suggested that Lynne get a pass to swim alone at the pool on the base. So Lynne left on her bike to try and get the required permission from a base official, but she returned home within 10 minutes without it. So she was a bit annoyed because she couldn't go swimming, but she really didn't act out. Her father would recall that she seemed resigned not to be able to go to the pool that day.
And so Lynne began washing the supper dishes, and that took her about 20 minutes. Once done with that chore, Lynne walked to the back door without saying goodbye to her father, who was still sitting in the living room. Her mother was chatting with a neighbor, Betty McDougal, in the backyard. Lynne stopped for a moment to see Mrs. McDougal's newborn baby, and then she strolled off. Her mother didn't ask Lynne where she was going, and Lynne didn't say where she was going. And it was 6:15 p.m. at that point. So Lynne walked down the road wearing turquoise shorts, a sleeveless white blouse, and brown shoes. She wore a locket that she received from her aunt 3 weeks earlier. It had a Royal Canadian Air Force crest inside of a heart made of plexiglass on a gold chain.
Well, like Lynne, Steven had also spent the afternoon playing baseball. He got home about 5:15 and played in his front yard. At about 5:50, his mother asked him to go buy coffee. Steven returned with the coffee, and he had a rip in the seat of his jeans near the top of his right leg. His mother wasn't happy about this, but Steven explained that he'd ripped them on his brother's bicycle, and that he'd scratched himself up as well. "Oh, I think you'll live," his mother told him. "Your pants will do. Now go on out and play for a few minutes until supper's ready." So Steven ate his meal quickly and left the house as soon as he could after. He knew he had to be home by 8:30 at the latest. He and his older brother Ken rotated the babysitting duties. His parents were going out, and it was Steven's turn to take care of his younger sister and brother, so his free time was cut short that evening. At about the same time Lynne was leaving her home, Steven was riding around the base on his bike. A bright green racer with foot-long streamers attached to the handlebars, this bike was Steven's prized possession. Gord Logan, a good friend of his, saw Steven near the school, and he asked Steven if he was going to go swimming. Steven said no, but said he might be down later. The county road was busy with the usual after-dinner influx of cars, bikes, and strollers. Several people saw Steven around 6:30, biking up and down the road between the school and the bridge.
Beatrice Geiger had borrowed her son's bike, and with her young daughter on a crossbar, bicycled down to the river. She was riding slowly, and saw Steven Truscott pass her on his bicycle. Steven went onto the bridge, and then turned around and came back. Beatrice's son Ken was walking down to the river when his friend Rob picked him up on his bike, and they both went down to the river. Near Lawson's Bush, they noticed Steven just sitting on his bike on the road. Paul Desjardins, age 14, was going to the river to fish. He remembered seeing Steven just circling on his bicycle on the county road near the bush. At the time, nobody thought anything of this. Steven's actions seemed to be the aimless wanderings of a teenage boy on a summer evening. But later, in the eyes of the police, Steven's trips to the bridge and down near the bush would become evidence of a murderer plotting his crime.
It would. So this really was just an ordinary summer evening. Butch George was mowing Mrs. McDougal's lawn. Jocelyn Gaudette was washing the supper dishes. Down by the river, Richard Gellatley was thinking of biking home to change into his swimming trunks. Gord Logan was getting ready to fish, and Dougie Oates was looking for turtles with Karen Daum. A 10-year-old named Philip Burns took his last dive in the river and was about to start his hike home. Few of the children wore watches. None of them had any reason to remember specific events or times. Nothing remarkable was going on. People were swimming and riding up and down the road as they did most summer evenings. At 6:15 p.m., Lynne had begun making her way to the playground near the school. Lynne didn't arrive at the playground for 20 minutes, even though it was just a 5-minute walk from her house. The police never seemed curious to fill in these 15 minutes of time in Lynne's afternoon, which could have been significant, and that's a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Jocelyn Gaudette, one of Lynne's friends and classmates, left her house at around the same time, but we don't know if Lynne saw her that evening. When Lynne arrived at the school around 6:35, Ann Nickerson, 32, was preparing a scavenger hunt for a group of brownies. Lynne leapt at the chance to help her out. Nickerson accepted her offer and Lynne helped her organize the girls, 5 to a team. As the scavengers headed out, Nickerson and Lynne talked under a tree for about 20 minutes. The two chatted, and Lynne told her that she didn't want to go home because her mother was cross with her, but at the same time Lynne seemed to be joking.
It wasn't too much longer until Steven Truscott arrived nearby on his bike. Steven was wearing scruffy brown shoes, red jeans, and a white shirt. Almost immediately, Lynne went over to him and sat on the front wheel of his bike. So by all accounts, it was Lynne who approached Steven, and she did most of the talking. Two of the brownie mothers couldn't hear what they said, and they were paying little attention to them. It had just been 4 days since Lynne had danced with Steven at the house party, and now Lynne had a chance to speak to him. "What are you doing, Steve?" Lynne began. This is according to Steve's memory of their conversation. "Well, I was going down to the river to see if any of the kids were there," he told her. "Can I have a ride down to the highway?" she asked. "Well, I'm going that way anyhow," he said. It was a short moment between two young people in a noisy school playground filled with other children. But Lynne and Steven set off for what was to become the most famous bike ride in Canadian legal history.
Yeah. So the time they left together would be in dispute in the months and the years to come. The two adults supervising the brownies said they last saw Lynne and Steven sometime between 7 and 7:10. Only one of the women had a watch, and she hadn't looked at it for a while. Once they left the brownie pack, Lynne and Steven still had to walk around the school to get onto the county road. And at the far end of the building, the kindergarten classroom extended out from the rest of the school. Steven looked through the big windows and saw the clock on the wall. It was around 7:25 p.m., he would later recall. As Lynne and Steven circled the school, they passed several boys who were playing baseball. Steven was pushing his bicycle and Lynne was walking up alongside him, according to Warren Heatherall, who thought it was around 7 o'clock when he saw them, but he couldn't be sure. One of the other ball players, Stuart Westy, thought it was closer to 7:30, but he also admitted he wasn't sure. Two younger boys who were playing in the same area gave later time estimates. One thought it was between 7:15 and 7:30, and the other boy thought it was about 7:25 p.m. But once they were on the county road, Lynne hopped on the crossbar of Steven's green bike. It was a steady downhill ride to the river. Lynne was laughing and smiling, turning her head frequently to talk to Steven. And Steven would later tell police that Lynne told him she was upset with her parents because they wouldn't let her go swimming. Then she asked him if he knew the person in the little white house not far from the highway, and she said she might go down there to see the ponies.
Yeah, this is a place where the grumpy old guy lived, right?
Yes. I don't know if he was grumpy, but he was a recluse. You do get that image in your head of maybe he was a little grumpy.
Yeah.
So on their right, they passed the fields of Lawson's farm. They had only biked a few hundred feet when they passed classmate Richard Gellatley, who was heading south back towards the base. He put the time at about 7:25. Now, it would have taken Richard only a couple of minutes to get to his house after seeing Steven, and his father later confirmed to police that his son was back home at about that time. So that could be pretty close to accurate.
Yeah. You have agreement, people's testimonies?
Yeah.
Good to have.
Sure.
So Stephen and Lynne met Richard somewhere between the O'Brien farm and Lawson's bush, which ran for about 900 feet along the highway. At the end of the bush, Stephen and Lynne came to the small tractor trail. No more than 3 or 4 minutes had passed since they left the school, and they had biked around 3,300 feet, maybe 3/5 of a mile.
So what happened next, or didn't happen, is at the center of the entire case. The events of the next few seconds would consume the opinions of citizens, journalists, judges, and prime ministers for at least the next 4 decades. In the minds of the police investigators, the prosecution, and eventually a jury, Stephen made a sharp right turn at this point off the county road and took Lynne, either willingly or unwillingly, into the bush. While there, he raped and strangled her. But according to Stephen and his supporters, he never turned off the county road at all. He continued to ride with Lynne past the bush and down toward the bridge and the river.
So the evidence either way was not clear. According to Stephen, he continued to bike with Lynne past Lawson's bush, picking up speed as the road went down toward the river. After about 1,500 feet, they crossed the tracks, and 500 feet later, they approached a small concrete bridge over the Bayfield River. Now, the strongest support for Stephen's account would come from an 11-year-old boy standing on that bridge. His name is Dougie Oates. Dougie had only one thing on his mind that evening, and that was turtles. He was very interested in nature. He liked to go out, catch turtles, and bring them home as pets. His memories were very precise, and they were fixed in his mind because police questioned him within 2 days of the events. Dougie had left home around 6, but he'd taken his time getting to the river. He stopped for a few minutes along the road to watch 2 female cardinals. Once at the river, he saw a small turtle and went down under the bridge to grab it. Then he traded his small turtle for a larger one. He continued to hunt from the bridge when he saw 2 people on a bike.
Yeah, he saw both Stephen and Lynne riding double across the bridge within feet of him. He couldn't see one of them without the other. A boy and a girl riding double on a bike made him take notice. Dougie said hi and waved at the teenagers. Lynne smiled at him, and Stephen kept pedaling toward the highway. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind I saw both of them, Dougie has said repeatedly. It's etched in my memory. And Dougie wasn't the only person who was certain he saw Stephen and Lynne cross the bridge at that moment. The river was filled with children, most of them too busy playing to pay much attention to the traffic on the bridge. But one boy in the water did notice, Gord Logan, the boy who had asked Stephen earlier at the school about his swimming plans, was at the swimming hole about 600 feet from the bridge. I was standing by the river, Gord later told police. I think it must have been nearly 7:30 when I saw Lynne and Stephen. I'm sure it was her. She was wearing shorts, I think. A third boy, Butch George, originally told the police that as he swam in the river, he also saw that Steve and Lynne were biking north. But he would later recant that statement. And remember, Butch is the one who has trouble with the truth.
Right. So Stephen would later tell the police that down at the bridge he saw his friend Butch in the river. He waved to me and I waved back, Stephen told them. Once past the bridge, Stephen said he took Lynne along the final 1,300 feet to the highway and dropped her off at the intersection where cars were whizzing by. After a quick goodbye, they separated. Lynne didn't say anything more about where she was going. Stephen turned and headed south along the county road toward the river. Gord confirmed he saw Stephen return to the bridge, this time alone, about 5 minutes after he'd seen Stephen cross the bridge with Lynne.
So if that's the case, it would have been impossible for Stephen to have turned off the trail with her or done anything to her.
Right. And you have the suspect, Stephen, saying this is what I did, and it's pretty much confirmed by witnesses.
It is, but things really get twisted around. So as Stephen approached the bridge on the return trip, he was on the west side of the county road. He said that he stopped and looked back to see if it was safe to cross the road to watch his friends in the swimming hole. As he glanced back, he said he saw what looked like a gray 1959 Chevrolet car traveling eastbound on the highway. The car turned in slightly onto the county road, then crossed the road and stopped on the corner where Lynne was standing. The car was then parked on the county road slightly at an angle with its rear bumper facing Steven. Steven was pretty sure that the car was a '59 Chevy because he had a teenage boy's fascination with cars. That was the first year Chevy changed the style of their car, and they had large fins going out like wings. And the taillights looked like cat's eyes. And there was no other car around like that. In fact, several models, such as the Ford 58 Fairlane, the 56 Victoria, and the 57 T-Bird, all had prominent rear fins. But still, the '59 Chevy was rather distinctive. Steven also said he'd caught a glimpse of something yellow or orange on the back bumper. The sun was shining on the fender, and it may have only been a glare. He couldn't tell if it was a license plate or a sticker or whatever, Steven said, and that was a detail that would soon get confused in the police records.
As he made his way over to the railing on the eastern side of the bridge, Steven thought nothing more about the car or Lynne. He saw several of his friends playing in the water, but he didn't talk to anyone. Alan Oates, Dougie's 16-year-old brother, claimed he saw Steven standing alone on the bridge around 7:45. Alan had been home watching his favorite TV news program, Panorama, until 7. He then wandered around the base until he was near the railway tracks, about 800 feet away from the bridge. He remembered seeing Steven. Steven said he lingered at the river for 5 to 10 minutes before heading back to the Air Force Base because he was supposed to be babysitting.
So 2 boys, Dougie Oates and Gord Logan, saw Lynne and Steven cross the bridge. 2 boys, Gord and Dougie's brother Alan, saw Steven alone on the bridge just a few minutes later. Over the following weeks and months, in various police interrogations, courtroom testimonies, and cross-examinations, the boys would never change any of the details of what they had seen that day, but they still would be called liars, co-conspirators, or foolish kids with bad memories. If Gord Logan and Dougie and Alan Oates were sure they'd seen Steven and Lynne, or Steven alone down by the bridge around 7:30, 2 other children, Butch and Jocelyn, would insist that they had no luck finding Steven or Lynne that evening, despite their efforts to track them down. But unlike the consistent accounts by the Oates brothers and by Gord Logan, the stories by Butch George and Jocelyn Gaudette were conflicted, confusing, and they were repeatedly changing.
And I would just remind people that both these kids had a reputation for bending the truth.
They did, and they changed their stories. If they had a reputation for bending the truth, but then they were consistent and believable, that would be different.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of things very shaky about the stories of these 2.
So after he'd finished mowing the neighbor's lawn around 6:30, Butch George said he rode his bike to Steven's house. He called out from the front yard, "Is Steve home?" And Steve's mother answered, "He isn't home." But Butch rode his bike down the county road toward the river, and by the time he reached Lawson's Bush, he saw a boy named Philip Burns walking up toward the Air Force Base. He got off his bike as he came up to me and asked me if I saw Steve or Lynne, Philip recalled later. I said I never saw them.
Well, Philip, who was 10, did tell Butch that he'd just met Jocelyn Gaudette near the laneway into the bush. She had also asked him, Philip later told the police, if he'd seen Steven or Lynne, but he hadn't. Butch soon caught up with Jocelyn just as she was coming out of the laneway, and Jocelyn claimed she had walked about 200 feet down the tractor trail, very close to where Lynne's body would eventually be found, looking for Steven. So Jocelyn said she had a date with him to go looking for calves in the bush, and that's what she would later tell the police. "I didn't tell anyone about this plan to meet Steven because he told me not to tell anyone," she claimed. Jocelyn and Butch agreed that they met near the laneway, but they really agreed on very little else. In Butch's version, their exchange went like this. "Have you seen Steven?" he asked her. "No," Jocelyn said. "Have you seen Lynne?" "No," Butch replied. "If I see Lynne, I'll tell you." "Okay," said Jocelyn. According to Jocelyn, she was the one who asked Butch if he had seen Steven, not Lynne, but Butch said no. By Jocelyn's account, her meeting with Butch took place shortly after 6:30, but by Butch's account, it was well after 7 p.m., and both of them said that they then went separately down to the river. Butch said when he was by a rock pile at the river, he saw Jocelyn near the bridge, and that she asked him again if he had seen Lynne, and he said no. But Jocelyn said that she saw Butch at the river but didn't talk with him. She only asked another boy about the fishing. Jocelyn said she was only at the bridge for about 10 minutes before heading back toward the base. No one besides Butch would ever corroborate her claim to be at the bridge at all that night. Jocelyn, Butch, and Philip all told different and at times contradictory stories about not seeing Steven or Lynne that evening, but their testimonies would later be at the center of the prosecution's eyewitness case against Steven Truscott. The 3 children did not see Steven, the argument went, because when Jocelyn, Butch, and Philip were near the bush, Steven was already in the woods less than 300 feet away, strangling Lynne to death.
According to the police, when the coast was clear, Steven came out from the bush where he had left Lynne's lifeless body. Then he walked along the laneway and biked up the road until he reached the school. By Steven's account, after dropping off Lynne at the highway, he left the bridge and headed home. Either way, nobody disputes the fact that Steven was at the school grounds around 8 o'clock. There would be disputes over the exact time of his return, but there would be no disagreement over the fact that more than a dozen children saw him immediately upon his return to school, and everyone said he looked normal and as calm as he always was. "What did you do with Harper? Feed her to the fish?" teased one of the boys on the baseball field. "No, I just left her off at the highway like she asked," Steven replied. Steven then made his way around the corner of the school, near the basketball courts, and headed to the swings, where an older group of teenagers were hanging out.
Yes, Lorraine Wood would recall, "A bunch of the girls and I had just gone up there and we were sitting swinging." Now, Lorraine had danced with Steven 4 days before at her party. Several boys, including Steven's older brother Ken, joined the girls there. Lorraine and 2 of her friends estimated Steven showed up near them about 8:10 to 8:15, and one of the boys there said it was closer to 8 p.m., but none of the teenagers noticed any scratches, sweat, or blood on Steven's face or arms. Ken reminded his younger brother he had to go home soon to babysit, and Steven took off across the school grounds and headed home. "I made it, Mom," he called out as he ran into the house. "You're lucky," said his mother, Doris. She then gave Steven instructions for babysitting his siblings. Bill had some homework to do, and Barbara had to be put to bed no later than 9 p.m. Around 8:45 p.m., Doris and Dan Truscott joined their neighbors for food and conversation out at the sergeant's mess hall. Back at the house, Steven grabbed some snacks from the kitchen, and he prepared for a boring night in of babysitting. While Steven was babysitting, several of his friends were still hanging out by the river. Around 8:20 p.m., 3 boys biked back to the base together: Butch George, Richard Gelattley, and Kenny Geiger. As they made their way up the hill past the railway tracks and Farmer Lawson's bush, Richard told them that he had met Steven and Lynne on his bike. Then Butch said that Steven and Lynne were in the bush, but he didn't know what they were doing there. So this was the first time anyone had mentioned Steven and Lynne together in the bush. Harmless words at the time, but this would soon become very ominous. By all accounts, Butch George was not the most popular kid at the base. He was known as mean and a bit of a smartass. Some of the hostility came from prejudice he suffered because he was an outgoing native boy in a conservative white military community. His father was a butcher in the Supply and Services Department, and Butch lived in a somewhat run-down house with an older sister, 2 younger twin brothers, and a teenage uncle or cousin. People had seen his parents outside of their house, and they'd seen his father yelling at his mother. But what seemed to bother the other children most about Butch was his untrustworthiness. He changed his stories every day, and he tended to exaggerate a lot. He seemed so used to making stuff up that it may have been just a reflex for him. So Butch started getting people's attention on Tuesday evening by telling anyone who would listen that Steven had taken Lynne into the bush. It is possible Butch got the idea to start this tale just by putting 2 and 2 together. Around 7:15, at the entrance to the tractor trail leading to the bush, he'd met Jocelyn, who he said told him she was looking for Lynne. Then about 15 minutes later, according to Butch's original story to the police, when he was down at the river, he saw Steven and Lynne go across the bridge on Steven's bike. And less than an hour later, Richard Gelattley told Butch he had also seen Steven and Lynne on the bike together. So Butch's story seems like a bit of a work in progress. He started telling people Steven was going to take Lynne there, which implied some prior knowledge to Steven's plans, or that he heard that Steven was in the bush, presumably from some unnamed third party, or that he saw Steven go into the bush with his own eyes, though he never explained where he was or what time he had seen this.
And this is testimony that everyone believed.
Not everyone, no.
Well, the jurors.
Yes, but then it had been, played with quite a bit.
Sure has.
Yeah, and he'd been talking to detectives, and it had been narrowed down, I imagine.
Yeah. On Tuesday night, soon after saying goodbye to Kenny and Richard, when they got up to the base, Butch ran into Alan, another 14-year-old. Alan was playing with his bow and arrow set, using a cardboard box up against a post as a target. "Truscott is in the bush with Harper," Butch called out. "Oh, is that right?" Alan replied. Alan didn't think much of it at the time. A few minutes later, Butch had reached Steven's house. It was around 8:45. Steven's parents had already left for the evening. Butch first told the police the two friends never talked about Lynne that night, but then he changed his mind and said Steven told him that he and Lynne were looking for a cow and a calf. Steven, however, denied that this conversation ever happened, and there's no witnesses to the conversation, so it's he said, she said, or he said,
Yeah, it's Steven's word versus Butch's word. But what everyone did agree on was that no one took Butch's tale seriously, at least at first. They just thought it was funny. The boys really couldn't imagine Steven, the school jock and kind of a hunk in the eyes of many of the older girls, would be trying to make a pass at a young girl who they saw as awkward and a bit of an outsider. Butch, the boy no one trusted, couldn't get his story straight. Earlier that evening, Butch was near the bush, supposedly looking for Steven, when he met Jocelyn. But he told her he hadn't seen Lynne or Steven. Within 2 hours, Butch was telling 7 different boys that he had seen Steven go into the bush with Lynne, and over the next 6 days he would change his story at least 3 times. But it didn't matter all that much whether Butch's tale was true or not. It soon took on a life of its own. In the next 2 days, other children would hear his story about Steven taking Lynne into the bush, and they'd tease Steven about it. And Steven reacted with frustration, and eventually anger. Then the police would look at that reaction as another sign of Steven's guilt. So the sun set that Tuesday evening at 9:08 p.m. At the Harper house, Lynne still hadn't shown up. Most of the other children on the base were safe at home by then. Lynne's coming-in time was 9 p.m. and her bedtime was 9:30. She didn't come home and her parents were pretty worried by 9:15. Shirley asked Lynne's older brother Barry to go look for her, and Lynne's father joined in the search while Shirley stayed at home, anxiously walking around the house and waiting for Lynne on the back step. Then, around 10:30 p.m., George Archibald, a sometime boyfriend of Lynne's, showed up in the Harpers' front yard. He had just come from the Custard Cup, which is kind of like a Dairy Queen, I guess, and heard Butch's story about Steven going into the bush with Lynne. Lynne had also promised to lend George her sleeping bag. Then meanwhile, over at the sergeant's mess hall, Doris and Dan Truscott and their friends were winding down their evening. Steven's parents returned home by 11 to find him and the other children all asleep. Doris woke up Steven's younger brother Bill to take him to the bathroom, and then she and Dan went to bed as well.
The first officially recorded concern about Lynne Harper's whereabouts came at 11:20, when her father Leslie Harper went to see Flight Sergeant Frank Johnson, a neighbor who also happened to be in charge of the Air Force Police. According to the military logs, Johnson notified the police with the message, Lynne Harper, age 12 years, 5 foot 3 inches tall, 100 pounds, white print blouse, blue shorts, that she hadn't been home since about 1900 hours, and that it was possible she was hitchhiking to her grandmother's in Port Stanley, Ontario.
Corporal William A. Webb was on duty at the guardhouse when he got a phone call from Lynne's father at 11:25 p.m. Flying Officer Harper sounded very distressed, he reported. When further questioned as to any possible place the girl might have gone to, Flying Officer Harper stated that she might have headed for Port Stanley, Ontario, where her grandmother was living. In about 15 minutes, 3 separate reports indicated that Lynne was probably a hitchhiking runaway, information that only could have come from Lynne's parents. Their first impulse was that their missing daughter had tried to go to her grandmother's, which was about 80 miles away. But then months later, Lynne's mother would tell the police that Lynne would never hitchhike anywhere.
On Wednesday, June 10th, the temperature would go up to 90 degrees in Clinton. In homes across the military living quarters, children were excited that they only had to sit through half a day of classes. School was ending at noon for a local fair. But Shirley and Leslie Harper had a growing sense of dread. There was no sign of their little girl. At 7:30 in the morning, Leslie went to see the father of Gary Hoyer, one of Lynne's friends. But Shirley and Leslie Harper had a growing sense of dread. There was no sign of their little girl. At 7:30 that morning, Leslie went to see the father of Gary Hoyer, one of Lynne's friends. Harper learned that it was possible one of the Truscott boys had seen his daughter, so he went to their house. And on the way, he ran into Steven's father and asked if he could ask the Truscott boys if they had seen Lynne.
Yes, on the second floor of their small house, the Truscott children were getting ready for school. Doris had put out fresh clothes for her two youngest, Barbara and Bill. Stephen gave her the dirty red jeans he had worn the day before and put on a clean pair. But before Stephen could sit down to eat, Lynne's father knocked on their door. When the door opened, Stephen was in the kitchen looking down into the stairwell. When asked, he said that he had taken Lynne to the corner on his bike and that she had hitched a ride on the number 8 highway. "Oh my God," Lynne's father said. The information seemed to confirm his fear that his daughter had taken off to her grandmother's house. For the moment, it was the only explanation the Harpers had for Lynne's disappearance. Her older brother Barry told a friend that morning that his sister had taken off. She was angry, he said, and might have tried to hitchhike to visit her grandparents. An official Air Force log for that day read that a search was not deemed necessary at that particular time. So see, in the beginning, the brother and the parents are thinking Lynne would have hitchhiked trying to go to her grandmother's. But then later on, as Stephen becomes a suspect, they start to think, no, our daughter would never hitchhike.
Well, did she have the kind of relationship with her grandparents that if there was strife at home, she'd turn to them?
Perhaps. It seems like that. Yeah, why else would they think that? Because she hadn't told anyone that, but they were kind of thinking maybe that's what she was doing. So
yeah, I don't know why they would say she must have gone to her grandparents.
Because where else would she go, I guess? Where else are they going to think she would possibly go? That's the only place they could think of. I don't know why it was the grandmother. I'm just thinking that's the only place they could possibly think of. My bigger concern is the hitchhiking. Why did they think she would hitchhike and then later on thought, no way would she hitchhike? And they've lost their daughter, so I'm not going to point fingers at them or blame them for that. But it was really a change in attitude that I think may have been influenced by the investigators.
Okay.
To get them to focus on, Stephen being the person that had taken her.
At first, the school day began the way it always did. But at 9:15, the routine was disrupted by the appearance of a police cruiser. On their way to the school, Constable Hobbs and the RCAF police had picked up Stephen's father at his office on the base. Then Dan Truscott went inside to get his son. They had Stephen come out and he sat in the front seat of the cruiser. According to Constable Hobbs, Stephen said that he had given a ride on his bike to Lynne. He had picked her up outside the school between 7:25 and 7:30. According to Stephen, Lynne said she knew the people in the little white house along the highway and she might go down to see the ponies. She also said she had to be home by 8 or 8:30. According to Constable, Stephen said that he took her to the highway and dropped her off, and then he returned to the bridge over the river. He said he saw her again when he looked back and saw her get into a late model Chevy. He mentioned a lot of chrome, and it could have been a Bel Air version. He said the car appeared to have a yellow license. He said, there was no one in the rear. I am not sure how many were in the front. And that was the end of the conversation. Now, this was the morning right after Lynne's disappearance, and presumably Stephen's memory of the events of the previous evening was the freshest it would ever be.
So by recess that day, everyone at school was talking about Lynne's disappearance. Stephen's friends were curious about his talk with the police. They knew he was the last one to see Lynne Harper, so they were asking him all about it. And when Stephen went home for lunch, he had his second police interview in 3 hours. This time there was a new investigator, Constable Donald Trumbley, an officer who would do a lot of the work on the case. Again, sitting in the front seat of a cruiser, Stephen repeated his story. Now, according to Trumbley's notes, Stephen insisted that the car he saw at the corner was a '59 Chevy. This time, Stephen gave more details. He said it had white wall tires and a lot of chrome with yellow markers. Trumbley asked Stephen how he could tell what make of car it was, and Steven described how the car pulled onto the county road from the highway, onto the shoulder, and then crossed the road and parked on the right side with its rear fender facing the bridge. The officer recorded that Steven referred to seeing something yellow at the rear of the car. At this point, as far as the police were concerned, Lynne Harper was still a runaway. So Constable Hobbs took a photo of Lynne to the nearest TV station and later sent a photo to a larger TV station in London. Then at 4 p.m., Constable Trumbley drove to the bridge over the Bayfield River, where Steven had told him he had seen Lynne and the car. Trumbley observed traffic proceeding up and down number 8 highway and couldn't distinguish any license numbers, he later said. The police would later say that this was when they began to have their first doubts about Steven's story. But Steven had said nothing about reading any specific license numbers on a car. He had just told the police he saw something yellow on the back of the car, possibly a license plate. Steven had also said he was looking at a car parked on the edge of the county road, not at vehicles that were speeding along the highway, which is what Trumbley had been looking at that day. So Trumbley had gone back to Steven's house, but Steven wasn't home, and that afternoon Steven and his friends had gone to another swimming hole, the gravel pits between Clinton and Goderich. In shorts or bathing suits, the boys played around and jumped in and out of the water out in the hot sun. And no one noticed any scratches, scars, or anything else unusual about Steven.
By 5 p.m., when Constable Trumbley returned to the Truscott home, he found Steven there with his mother and convinced them both to go with him down to the bridge. He asked Steven where he was standing when he observed the car picking up Lynne Harper, and he walked over to a point 10 feet south of the north end of the bridge, Trumbley wrote. Again, he had observed traffic on a number 8 highway. He still couldn't identify any license numbers. Now, this was again a strange comment because Steven had not talked about seeing any digits. Just that there seemed to be something yellow on the back bumper.
Yeah, he said maybe a license plate. So as he walked back to the car with Steven and another officer, Trumbley repeated the same comment about license numbers. Doris Truscott, who had stayed in the police cruiser, said, well, maybe it wasn't a yellow license marker Steven had seen at all. Maybe it was a sticker like the one we have in our car. The Truscotts, like many families, had a tourist sticker from a local attraction on their rear fender. And according to the police notes, Steven said nothing at all at that point. But his mom was beginning to worry about the police interest in Steven. By the time the sun was beginning to go down, children were gossiping about Steven's role in Lynne's disappearance. And some families were already getting suspicious. They knew that she'd last been seen at the school the evening before, riding off with Steven, and that he had said she got into a car at the highway.
At supper time that Wednesday, Butch George claimed he dropped by his friend Steven's house. Steven denies this, and the supposed conversation with Butch never happened. But Butch was very precise about the details. He just kept changing the time. He would later say that the conversation had happened at around 5 o'clock. But 5 o'clock wouldn't make sense because the police had been with Steven around the same time. Regardless, Butch described this conversation as being very damning for Steven. He described Steven and him deciding that Butch should lie about Steven's whereabouts with Lynne on the evening she disappeared. And he would later change the time of this conversation as happening at 6 p.m., which would clear up any discrepancies in the timeline.
So on June 11th, 2 days after Lynne disappeared, searchers were out looking for her. At 1:50 p.m., when the sun was high overhead, Corporal George Edens and his fellow airmen pushed through the branches and bushes, hoping that they wouldn't find the little girl's body. Edens was in the group assigned to search the wooded area known as Lawson's Bush on a farm next to the base. The men walked in a straight line, 20 feet apart. For 30 minutes, they slowly made their way through the bush. Then, moving some branches and undergrowth out of the way, Edens spotted Lynne's brown shoes. Moments later, he saw a neat pile of clothes lying in a little depression of earth. Then he turned and saw her body. Now they knew that Lynne was dead. Edens was too stunned to even call out, and another searcher came up behind him and yelled out, shaking Edens out of his shock. Now everyone knew that Lynne was not at her grandmother's house. She'd been murdered, and she appeared to have been sexually assaulted. Her body was in a small hollow about 6 feet long and 15 inches deep behind a cluster of 5 trees. 3 branches lay across her body. 6 to 8 feet away, searchers saw 3 freshly broken limbs from other small ash trees. Her body was about 80 feet from a tractor trail and 280 feet from the busy county road. She was on her back with her right leg slightly turned and bent at the knee. Her left leg was straight. Her left arm lay across her chest and her right arm was bent at the elbow, palm up next to her head. The only clothing covering her was her blood-smeared undershirt, which was pulled up on her chest. The sleeveless white blouse she'd been wearing had been ripped and yanked off. Her right arm was still caught in the armhole. The ends of the blouse were rolled up and tied tightly around her neck with a knot under the left side of her jaw. There was a small pool of blood, about enough to fill a tablespoon, that had coagulated beneath her left shoulder.
So the discovery of a 12-year-old's nearly naked body was way too gruesome for even some of the experienced men to stomach. Her face and body were swollen, and maggots and insects oozed out of her nose, mouth, and genitals. In shock and horror, the researchers covered up her body with their shirts and jackets. The well-meaning men wanted to protect the young girl's dignity, but in doing this, they had compromised the crime scene and may have even destroyed potential evidence. From the start, the investigation into the murder of Lynne Harper was mishandled. The Ontario Provincial Police arrived just after 2. Donald Trumbley was joined by Corporal Sayo. Even for the police, this murder of a young girl was shocking. Still, the officers worked carefully and were committed to find the killer as soon as possible. The Clinton coroner, Dr. Fred Thompson, was there at 2:35, but he was told not to do anything until the regional pathologist arrived from Stratford. A second doctor on the scene, Dr. David Hall Brooks, formally identified Lynne's body. Brooks was a senior medical officer at the base and lived across the street from the Harpers. Lynne was his daughter's Girl Guide patrol leader.
So, of course, the authorities had to notify Lynne's parents. For almost 2 days, they'd been hoping that their little girl was just acting out and running away. According to newspaper stories, her parents were so distressed when they were notified that doctors gave both parents sedatives. While the Harpers grieved, the police examined the crime scene. They took photos of the body, the clothes, and the surrounding area. They measured where everything was, and they took notes. Lynne's turquoise shorts were right next to her elbow, and her shoes were about a foot away. 15 inches above her head, they found her 2 white socks and the red hairband. Her underpants were much farther away, 38 feet and 8 inches. Police also found a black comb 78 feet away, and in the field nearby, 3 pieces of Kleenex and 2 Coke bottles, 1 empty and 1 full, also part of an uneaten hot dog from what appeared to be where someone had had a picnic. What was most surprising was the neat appearance of the scene. The leaves and earth around Lynne's body were undisturbed. No scraped dirt or broken branches from a violent struggle were there. Her underwear had no rips or tears. Her shorts were zipped up with no tears or cuts. There were no apparent wounds to her body except for a gash in her left shoulder, and she had strangulation marks on her neck. But her killer had not broken her neck or bludgeoned her head, and the police found no weapons there. 2 of the branches that lay across her body were crisscrossed over her chest and extended up alongside her cheeks, framing her face in a sort of V. At trial, the prosecution would portray the branches as a primitive attempt by a frightened boy to cover up his crime. But given that neat scene, the branches could also be interpreted as some kind of twisted staging. The police found no fingerprints on her body, her clothes, or the tree branches, but they didn't really have the technology to find those prints at the time. Today there are lasers that can identify prints on skin and clothes, but in 1959 the only hope the police had were Lynne's shoes, because some types of leather could reveal prints. But they had no luck with that either.
Yeah, and they didn't find any footprints in the area. At 4:48 p.m., Corporal Erskine took photos of marks just below Lynne Harper's feet. One was 10 inches long, the other 11 inches, both of them about 1/8 to 1/4 inch deep. He later described them as scuff marks that he could not get a proper measurement on. Now, none of the police reports on file mentioned footprints found near the body. Strangely, though, 3 months later at the trial, Flying Officer Glenn Sage, supervising the Air Force man at the site, said that he had spotted a print about 2 or 3 inches from Lynne's left heel. You could see the heel, wavy lines, as if from a crepe sole, he would recall. Sage would claim he even stopped a policeman from inadvertently stepping on this evidence. He said he was waiting for the police to take a plaster cast of it, except they never did that.
No. As Corporal Erskine was taking pictures, Dr. John Llewellyn Peniston, the district pathologist from Stratford, arrived. Peniston was a graduate from the University of London in England with a degree in medicine and surgery. When Lynne's body was moved, Peniston did not examine her for any foreign hairs or fibers. The pathologist collected his evidence, and he completed his work in less than an hour. Along the dirt tractor trail that ran along the bush, the police and Air Force officers found 2 different kinds of tracks, a set of fresh tire skid marks and some old bicycle tracks. How the police handled this evidence really says a lot about the tunnel vision that quickly took over their investigation. Bicycle tire marks that, by all accounts, were at least a week old would become, in the eyes of the police and the prosecution, incriminating evidence against Steven Truscott. On the other hand, they ignored, and actually kept hidden from the defense, testimony about fresh skid marks that possibly pointed to an adult killer in a vehicle. George Edens, the airman who had found Lynne's body, walked out of the bush along the tractor trail, and he saw a much fresher set of car tracks where the dirt trail met the pavement of the county road. 2 other airmen saw the same thing. Now, no police cars had entered the laneway, and the ambulance hadn't arrived yet, so it wasn't from them. This really sounded like a promising lead, and even the newspapers thought so. In the newspaper, it was written, George Edens said the murderer then backed his car out of a field and his skidding tires dug holes into the laneway in a hasty flight upgrade to the road. But that was the last public mention of these tire tracks, except for a brief reference to them by Edens himself at the trial, and the police never pursued that lead. The tire tracks spotted by Edens and his fellow airmen were quickly dismissed as the police began their narrow pursuit of their only suspect, and that, of course, was Steven Truscott. So those tire tracks were never checked to see if they were from a 59 Chevy or anything.
No, and it sounds like what Edens was talking about, backing the car out of the field and making some skid marks. That sounds like it should be investigated.
Sounds like a definite lead, yes. It sounds like a strong lead.
So Steven endured 5 police interviews in just 24 hours. Police came to school to question him and other students. The officers set up an area in a teacher's room at the school, and the principal dutifully brought them 1 student at a time, one after another. And the principal did stay in the room as the police questioned the kids. The most intriguing information came from Gord Logan, the 12-year-old who had been fishing at the swimming hole. He told Constable Hobbs he saw both Lynne and Steven on a bicycle going toward the highway, and that Steven returned and lingered at the bridge. If true, this was a significant eyewitness account. If Steven crossed the river with Lynne, then he couldn't have been in the bush murdering her. But Gord's eyewitness account, which corroborated Steven's story, was significant not only because of what he said, but when he said it. It was still only Thursday morning. This was before the body was found, and there would be no point in him making up a story or lying. And later, when Gord's statement became a central part of Steven's defense, the prosecution would try to suggest he made up the story to protect Steven, conveniently forgetting that Gord first made his statement before any cover-up would be necessary.
And 2 other students also said they had seen Steven and Lynne that evening. Richard Gelatley told the police he passed them on his bike near the school about 7:30, the same time he would stick to in all of his statements, but a time which the police and later the prosecution would find inconvenient for their case against Steven. Even more inconvenient was what Butch George told Hobbs that Thursday morning. Butch said that when he was down at the river, he saw Lynne and Steven on the bicycle going toward the highway. Butch's statement to the police was one he was going to have to retract once he became a star witness for the prosecution, and he would. So at the end of school that Thursday, the searchers had already found the body of Lynne Harper. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. Steven Truscott was quickly arrested. Investigators called in Criminal Investigations Branch Inspector Harold Graham to run the case. He'd been praised as an outstanding investigator who had already solved dozens of murder cases.
The community's reaction to Steven's arrest was mostly relief. Many were relieved that he was a local kid and not a serviceman, and the military were spared this embarrassment. But the police really didn't have much of a case, just circumstantial evidence and contradictory testimony.
Yeah, for a motive, the police used a story from Jocelyn Gaudette about having a secret date planned with Steven in the bush. So if Jocelyn couldn't make it, Steven must have taken Lynne in order to satisfy his need for sex. But no one could corroborate Jocelyn's story. Still, this became important evidence at the trial. Jocelyn would testify that she had stopped by Farmer Bob Lawson's farm for about an hour and a half, but Lawson told police that she had just stopped by for a few minutes, and that she had later come to him and tried to get him to change his times to match what she had told the police, and he'd told her he couldn't do that. Later, police notes would show that Jocelyn had changed her story many times.
Soon after Steven was jailed, his father, Dan, got news that would make defending Steven even more difficult. The family was asked to move off the base. It wasn't a direct order, but it was presented as something that would be best for everybody. The Air Force transferred Dan to a base near Ottawa, about 350 miles away.
That's really just cruel.
Yeah.
Isn't that horrible?
Hard for Doris not to think that her family was a victim of injustice by the higher-ups, and this was because Steven was not the son of an officer.
Well, absolutely. His 14-year-old son is in jail there, and they're going to make him move 350 miles away? It just seems like they're really railroading that kid.
Yes.
The Air Force seemed more eager even than the police to prove that Steven was guilty, but the Truscotts weren't going to abandon their son. Doris and the kids moved into a trailer in a park not far from the Goderich jail where Steven was being held. Ken, Steven's older brother, took a job at a local Pepsi bottling plant. To catch a glimpse of his brother, Ken scaled a tree near the prison wall, and he was just high enough to see Steven through the window of his cell block. But someone saw him and reported it, and Steven was soon moved to a windowless cell. Seems really cruel to this family. You have to wonder if the father was an officer, maybe this would have gone differently. If it was the opposite and Lynne was just a working man's daughter and Steven was an officer's son.
Well, you know how that would end up.
How would that end up?
He wouldn't be charged.
Okay. Well, unless he was guilty. But I just don't see anything here telling us that he did it.
No. Inspector Graham arrived in Clinton on Thursday, June 11th at 7:45 in the evening. He met with the investigators who had been handling the case so far to get familiar with it. Steven Truscott was not as strong a suspect originally because of the conflicting stories we had obtained in our early attempts to find Lynne Harper, Graham said later. A heinous crime was uncovered in the bush that day near Clinton, Ontario. It was not the type of crime an investigator would automatically attribute to a 14-year-old boy, but whether the person is 14 or 49, the investigator has the right, and in fact the responsibility, to talk to anyone who he feels may be able to assist him in determining the truth. Well, they didn't follow that guide.
No, they didn't. Sure, you have to follow that, but you can't pick and choose. The police's statement gave the description of the car, a 1959 Chevy, and not specifically a Bel Air, the model that the police would later say Steven had identified. The color was also vague, gray or white. Only the yellow plates were precise. Already Steven's report of some sort of yellow or orange marker on the rear of the car had been fixed in the police minds as license plates, and the time of Lynne's death would become one of their biggest issues. It's a vital clue in the early stages of a murder investigation because it helps police narrow the potential suspects. Graham was initially sure that Lynne's murder was believed to have taken place around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, June 10th. Well, first of all, Graham must have gotten his dates confused because Tuesday was the 9th of June, not the 10th. But then selecting 9 p.m. as the time of death was really going to create a problem for his investigation, because we know that Steven had been safe at home babysitting by that time. But any reference to the 9 p.m. time of death soon disappeared from the police case history once they had Steven arrested. And at trial, the prosecutor made sure the defense and the jurors never saw Graham's initial report. So that's not kosher.
No, you're not supposed to do that.
Not at all.
The medical examiner's analysis of the contents of Lynne's stomach was the focal point for the exact determination of her time of death. His determination about that time of death was crucial in convicting Steven Truscott. But oddly, for all its importance, the medical examiner gave little focus to the stomach in his autopsy report, writing content of approximately 1 pint of poorly masticated, only slightly digested food, including peas, onion, corn. And even more disturbing is how the medical examiner determined this list of contents. According to his assistant, the two of them poured the contents into a jar and then studied it by holding the jar up to the light to see what we could see.
That doesn't seem very scientific.
Well, that's because it isn't.
No.
So this opinion, the ME wrote, would place the time of death between 7:15 and 7:45 on 9th June 1959.
Very specific.
Yeah.
Crazy specific, I would say.
Well, and we know now, and they probably knew then, that looking at stomach contents and examining them is not a good way to determine time of death.
Well, they should have known, especially to such a specific time frame.
Yeah.
But at trial, the prosecution would claim that if there was a turning point in the police investigation into Lynne's murder, this was it. Only one person was known to be with Lynne in that time period, and that was Steven Truscott. The ME did add 2 other observations and assumptions to support his theory about this time of death, and these were the extent of decomposition of Lynne's body and the fact that rigor mortis had almost passed off. But it was his analysis of stomach contents that became the determining factor. So pathology is the science of the medical causes of death and the manner of death, murder, suicide, or accident. But time of death really isn't an exact science. The time can sometimes be estimated, but rarely determined exactly. There are too many variables from one person to the next, and in the environment where a death occurs. Those variables come into play with stomach contents. 2 individuals can eat the same meal but digest it at different speeds. Moods, such as fear and anger, play a big role in how the stomach reacts. But despite these variables, ME Dr. John Peniston managed to pinpoint a time of death with absolute precision. It's difficult to believe that a doctor, holding a jar of stomach contents up to a light bulb, would determine almost to the minute the only possible time Steven Truscott would have to kill Lynne. And evidence would later indicate that Dr. Peniston, in coming to such exact conclusions about the time of death, may have been eager to help the prosecution to get a conviction. Absolutely. So I don't know what the mentality is of these guys. Why would they want to get a conviction? What's with the tunnel vision? I mean, these fucking guys, they just seem to get this idea and then went with it. And it's a 14-year-old, so it just seems kind of crazy to me. I don't understand the tunnel vision. I don't understand why you would focus on a 14-year-old. And that does make you wonder if maybe they were just trying to get this over with and keep the military out of it. Maybe they knew more than we know they knew.
So Steven was tried as an adult, and he was eligible for the death penalty, which was legal in Canada at the time, and would be carried out by hanging.
Ugh.
Steven's trial began in September of 1959. Much of the testimony came from children. Many of them gave conflicting accounts. The star witnesses for the prosecution were Butch George and Jocelyn Gaudette, who had both changed their stories multiple times.
Well, even back in the late 50s, there were experts on interviewing children, but none of them were sought out or used at all. Remember, some of these kids were 9 or 10 years old, so easily manipulated.
Oh, sure.
So the other leading issue brought forth by the prosecution was the science, which has now been debunked. Determining Lynne's time of death down to 30 minutes is impossible, but at the time of the trial, it was apparently enough. The trial took 15 days. The prosecution asserted that Lynne was a cautious girl who did not hitchhike. It alleged that Steven sexually assaulted her, strangled her with her blouse, and then laid a few tree branches on her to cover her remains. They highlighted a series of apparently inconsistent statements that Steven had made in his statements to police, as well as the existence of 2 mysterious abrasions on his penis. So while first in custody, a family physician had been brought in to examine Steven, who had no scratches or injuries to his body at all. But the doctor had noticed 2 small abrasions on Steven's penis. For whatever reason, the doctor had indicated that these abrasions could have been made by sexually penetrating the victim in a rape. Steven had claimed that he had had these abrasions for a couple of weeks and didn't know their origin. It's believed that these abrasions were actually exaggerated and used to humiliate Steven. When the doctor at the jail examined Steven just days after that other doctor had, he noted no abrasions on Steven's penis at all, but this record would never come out at the trial. Steven's defense lawyer, Frank Donnelly, maintained that Lynne had dismounted from Steven's handlebars hundreds of meters past the entrance to the tractor trail where her body had been found, making it very unlikely that Steven had taken her all the way back to the tractor trail site in order to kill her. Both the prosecution and defense used the children's accounts of that evening to bolster their own determinations about the timing of the events. Although the children who backed up the prosecution's case had serious credibility issues, they were given more credit by the jury than the children who had seen Steven and Lynne cross the bridge, past the tractor trail, and had seen Steven alone right after dropping Lynne off near the highway. So it did not go well for the defense, to put it mildly.
Yes, Steven was found guilty on September 30th. His conviction and death sentence shocked many of the public. 1 year later, the federal government commuted his sentence to life with a 10-year parole eligibility period. His 1960 appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada was rejected. In May 1967, new forensic evidence was presented, and Steven testified before the Supreme Court of Canada. He and 25 other witnesses testified. After a 2-week hearing, the court ruled 8-1 against Steven getting a new trial. The judges stated that they simply didn't believe Steven's testimony. In 1969, so we're 10 years out, Steven was released on parole, and he lived in Kingston with his parole officer. He then lived in Vancouver for a short time before he settled in Guelph under a new name. In 1974, he was released from the terms and conditions of his parole. He married, and he and his wife raised 3 children together.
The Air Force Base in Clinton closed in 1971, but before it closed, a senior Air Force officer made a discovery that would really raise serious questions about the integrity of the investigation. A misplaced psychiatric file from 1959 reported on a man who was a sexual predator and sounded like a killer. The file would disappear again, but it was retrieved in the Ottawa National Archives years later, and it was part of a 900-page dossier on a Sergeant Alexander Kalichuk. At 35 years old, Kalichuk was a sergeant in the Air Force. He was stationed in Aylmer after 7 years at the Clinton base. This troubled man had a long history of sexual and alcohol problems. Back in 1950, Kalichuk was charged with an unspecified indecent act in Trenton. He paid a $10 fine and $39 in costs. He had a conviction for drunkenness in 1952, but military records indicate his sexual misbehavior continued. One report refers to a similar incident of exposure in Seaforth. The documents also mention a case in family court that was dismissed, but not before the authorities recommended treatment, quote, before the airman finds himself in severe difficulties. So Kalichuk finished grade 9 and he worked briefly as a farm laborer and a bulldozer operator. Then he was in the Air Force from 1941 to 1946. Then again from 1950 to 1955. He briefly left the military to take a civil service examination, but he failed and he re-enlisted in the Air Force by the end of 1955. Then from 1950 until August of 1957, Kalichuk worked at Clinton. His last summer there, he may have crossed paths with Lynne Harper's father, Leslie, who ran the supply department. Even when he was transferred to Aylmer, about an hour away, Kalichuk never went too far from Clinton. He lived on a farm about 12 miles off the base, and neighbors remembered his wife as a great cook, a wonderful woman, and a hard worker. But her husband had a reputation as a silent drinker. Kalichuk's wife had 2 older children from a previous marriage who both hated their stepfather. A stepdaughter who was 19 in 1959 said that he was sleazy and he gave her the creeps, and it didn't surprise her that he had tried to lure girls into his car.
Now, if Inspector Graham had investigated Lynne's case more thoroughly, it's likely he would have uncovered the case of Kalichuk, who tried to pick up little girls less than 3 weeks before Lynne went missing. On May 21, 1959, 10-year-old Nancy Davidson was walking back from school with two of her friends on a quiet country road about an hour's drive from Clinton. The girls noticed a car pull up and stop when the first girl went off to her house. Then, after the second girl had left, Nancy was alone. As she got close to her home, the strange man in the car pulled up beside her and asked her if there was a creek nearby that was good fishing. But then he asked her if she would get into his car. He wanted her to pick out the prettiest present, he said, showing her panties that he had in the car.
Is that something that would lure someone to the car? I mean, not to make fun of it because it's horrible, but isn't it usually candy or a puppy? Panties?
Yeah.
That's just very bizarre.
That's what he had to work with, I guess.
He must have been drunk.
Fortunately, Nancy's father approached in his car, and Nancy was able to run to safety. Nancy told her father what the man had done and said to her. Her parents called the police, who located the man not far away and brought him back to the Davidsons. He denied it, and Nancy called him a liar.
Good for her.
The police found alcohol and a bag full of panties under his front seat. They arrested him on charges of contributing to the delinquency of a minor.
Now, you think they could do better charges than that, like attempted abduction?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the magistrate dismissed the charges for lack of conclusive evidence.
Psh, bullshit.
But warned the Air Force of his suspicions.
Right.
Kalachuk paid a fine for illegal possession of liquor. Nancy's father remembered one of the officers telling him, "He might have got away with it here, but he'll be looked after by the Air Force."
Sure.
And just 11 days later, Lynne Harper disappeared.
So he seems like a better suspect than Steven Truscott.
Well, at the very least, it seems like you need to investigate.
Exactly. At least look into his whereabouts and everything and rule him out.
Yeah.
But Steven Truscott and his family maintained a low profile until the year 2000, when an interview on CBC television's show The Fifth Estate covered his case and brought some more public attention to it. In November of 2001, the Association in Defense of the Wrongly Convicted filed an appeal to have Steven's case reopened. A review began in January of 2002. Then it took until 2006 when Lynne's body was exhumed in order to test for DNA. But no usable DNA was recovered. So Steven's conviction went before the Court of Appeals for Ontario in June of 2006. The 5-judge panel heard 3 weeks of testimony and new evidence. Then in 2007, the Court of Appeal asked retired officer Hank Sayu, who had assisted Inspector Graham, why the police had never considered a sexual psychopath could be responsible for Lynne's murder, before narrowing their focus on Steven, and Sayu said he couldn't recall. So it was in August 28, 2007, when the Court of Appeal finally acquitted Steven Truscott of the murder charge. Although they issued an acquittal, they said that they were not able to declare Steven factually innocent of the crime. The Attorney General of Ontario apologized to Steven for the miscarriage of justice. The identity of Lynne's real killer will likely never be known. The Court of Appeal speculated that the crime scene pointed to someone else besides Steven, though. Lynne's bare feet and leg lacerations didn't make sense if Steven had lured her into the bush voluntarily. The fact that there was no struggle, the use of her blouse as a garrote, and sex while she was dead or dying seems out of place with a 14-year-old schoolboy whose sexual advances were rebuffed by a 12-year-old classmate. It looks a lot more like the work of a sexual deviant.
Understandably, Lynne's family remained convinced of Steven's guilt. Barry Harper, Lynne's older brother, said in 2002 that he did not believe Lynne had ever hitchhiked, despite testimony to the contrary from Lynne's close friends and the statements his parents gave to the police on the night Lynne disappeared. After the Attorney General made his apology, Steven Truscott said, "I don't really feel that the apology was sincere. For the past 4 years, they've had the same evidence as what the judges have had, and they chose to fight us every step of the way. The Crown chooses not to think about justice. It would almost appear that they are more interested in convictions."
I think that's pretty mild for him to say. That's reasonable, for sure. Very powerful words.
Yeah, Steven's acquittal would likely have never come without his wife Marlene's determination and hard work. From the time she learned about his case back in 1966, she believed he was innocent. When she married Steven, she vowed that she would make sure he had a family and would live a normal life. She had also promised herself that she would do everything possible to correct the mistake which occurred in 1959.
Yeah, so Steven's case did help to abolish the death penalty and changed Canada's justice system. He and his wife are really remarkable, though, in their determination and their strength through all this. All Steven ever wanted was his good name back. He was able to regain his physical freedom, but freedom from the stigma and shame that came with being a convicted murderer never was given to him. He lived with that. He was awarded $6.5 million in compensation by the Ontario government in 2008, and part of that he used to start the Truscott Initiative in Justice Studies at the University of Guelph, funding 2 scholarships for students in the field. But the sad part here is we're never going to know who did it.
No.
And once you're convicted, it always hangs over you. That's the thing.
Yeah, unless you have absolutely uncontested evidence to the contrary.
Right, like DNA and someone else that's arrested and convicted.
Right.
But that's not going to happen.
No, unless somebody on their deathbed confesses.
Yes, but it was 1959, so we're kind of running out of time for that to happen.
We are.
Yeah. Anyone who was an adult in 1959, a lot of them aren't around anymore.
No, they aren't.
Nope.
Because that is 60-some years ago, right?
Right, yeah. 64 years, right?
Good.
Yeah.
Good at math.
Right.
So, yeah, if you were in your 20s, you'd be late 80s.
Right,
So,
yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. It's just a really sad thing. But at least he didn't get killed. I mean, he was set up to be hung. So thank God that didn't happen.
He's fortunate there.
Yes.
And he must have been an okay prisoner because he was paroled after 10 years.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people did believe him and support him, you know. There were people who wrote poems, wrote plays, there were movies. And of course, there was his wife, Marlene, who came along and was a huge supporter.
She was tireless.
Yes. Yeah. Those two really in love.
It's time for listener feedback.
All right, Dickie, let's do a little feedback.
Okay. I got you just some voicemails today.
Love voicemails.
Couple of voicemails. One of them is going to give you 3 case suggestions. Very generous.
Okay. And who's that from?
That's from Matt from Australia. He has 3 cases that he thought we might be interested in.
All right, let's hear Matt's voicemail.
Morning, guys. This is Matt from New South Wales, Australia. Just want to thank you for the snifter and the little handwritten note from you, Jill, and other little bitties and pieces that are on my fridge. Anyway, got a couple of case suggestions for you. First one is a brand new one in Gympie, Queensland. A woman by the name of Sharon Graham, 63, has just been found guilty of having her lover, Bruce James, fed into a wood chipper to gain $750,000 in life insurance. It's pretty interesting because the 2 guys that she had put him in the wood chipper, she was also romantically involved with. And then there's another one for you, Dick. Well, you just love this anyway. The butcher of Bundaberg, Jayant Patel, Jayantpatel, is a surgeon working at Bundaberg Base Hospital. He was convicted of 3 counts of manslaughter. He got 7 years. And then all his convictions were quashed, caused major outrage in the community, well, sort of around Australia, really. And then I've got another one that was known as the Granny Killers. John Wayne Glover, between 1989 and 1990, 6 women aged 60 to 93. He was found guilty of murdering. He got consecutive life terms, but he hung himself in prison in 2005, gutless way out. But anyway, I finally listened to everything and caught up with every podcast that you've done, been on the road for hours and hours and hours. It keeps me awake, keeps me alive, and all I can do is shake my head at some of the stories. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, guys, keep up the good work, and see you later.
Okay. Thank you, Matt.
Sounds like Matt was at work or something.
Something was going on there. But that's okay. I love to get a voicemail. So the first case was Sharon Graham. A woman accused and convicted in the murder of her lover/fiancé, Bruce Saunders, with the help of her 2 boyfriends. Saunders was beaten with a crowbar, then fed into an industrial-sized wood chipper. So we've got kind of shades of Fargo here.
Yes, we do. Although they'd only gotten his one arm when the police arrived. His legs were sticking out of the wood chipper.
No way! That's just like Fargo.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, Sharon Graham was accused of being the architect of a plan to murder her ex-partner and disguised the crime as a horrific wood chipper accident. I don't know how you accidentally get into a wood chipper.
He accidentally fell in when he was feeding the logs.
Uh-huh.
Right.
So she pleaded not guilty in Brisbane Supreme Court to the murder of Bruce Saunders at a rural property about 70 kilometers northwest of the Sunshine Coast. At trial, the Crown prosecutor told the jury that Graham convinced Greg Roser to kill Saunders and then, with the help of another guy, Peter Koenig, to feed his body into an industrial wood chipper.
Yeah, and as Matt said, she was sexually involved with both of these guys. So Sharon's a player here.
I guess so. Well, she wanted Saunders to die so she could get his house and his car, plus a combined $830,000 payout from his life insurance and annuity. So Fuller told the jury that after the 3 men spent a day working to clear trees, Roser hit Saunders from behind with an iron bar and repeatedly struck him on the head until he stopped moving. Then Koenig helped Roser carry Saunders to the wood chipper and ran his body through it as they held onto his legs. And here's the really gross part, creating a 15-meter field of human remains and shredded clothing. That is really gory.
It's just a bloodbath.
Yeah.
This is a fairly recent case. We can look into that.
Sure. And the next one is Jan Patel, a surgeon accused of gross misconduct and manslaughter. After a second trial, he accepted a plea bargain for fraud. He lost his license to practice medicine and served 7 years in prison, and he was released in 2015. So concerns were first raised about Dr. Patel within months of his starting work at Bundaberg Base Hospital, Queensland. The public inquiry heard that he amputated the leg of a diabetic Aboriginal woman, then forgot about her. How?
It's not easy.
6 days later, this woman was discovered semi-comatose and gangrenous. Dr. Patel was also alleged to have carried out heart surgery on a man who was moaning and screaming because he was not anesthetized, and to have operated on a cancer patient despite being told he was too sick for surgery, and that patient died on the operating table. Dr. Patel failed to detect obvious breast cancer, as it was claimed, and repeatedly punctured vital organs during surgery. Queensland health authorities hired him solely on the basis of a deceitfully crafted curriculum vitae. Had they checked his qualifications or references, they would have learned that his license to practice had already been revoked in New York State because of gross negligence, while in Oregon restrictions had been placed on his license as well. But instead, health officials appointed him director of surgery and ignored the complaints against him for a full 2 years. In 2008, Dr. Patel, who had resigned and returned to the U.S. in 2005, was extradited to Brisbane, where he was found guilty in 2010 of 3 counts of manslaughter and 1 of grievous bodily harm. 2.5 years into a 7-year jail sentence, the verdicts were overturned on appeal, and 2 retrials have failed to secure convictions. So those doctors just get special treatment,
Dickie. I don't know how they work that one.
No idea. That's crazy.
Absolutely.
All right, so there was one more recommendation from Matt. Why don't you tell us about that one?
Yeah, this is the granny killer. John Wayne Glover was convicted of killing at least 6 elderly women over a 14-month period from 1989 to 1990. Glover murdered 6 women over that period in the suburbs of Sydney's North Shore. The fact that the victims were all elderly women led to Glover getting his nickname, the Granny Killer. Following his arrest in 1990, he admitted to the murders and was sentenced to consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He hanged himself in prison on September 9th, 2005.
So we now have a case suggestion from Jane. Is that a voicemail as well?
That's a voicemail as well.
Okay.
Hi, Jill and Dick. It's Jane Squire calling from San Francisco. I feel like I only contact you when I have books to recommend, but here I am again recommending a book to you. This came to mind because of the case that you just discussed about the young boys who went missing in Florida. That's a very complicated case, and among other things, it raised issues about the criminal justice system and that sort of thing. And I thought immediately of this book that I read recently. It's a relatively new book. It was published in March of this year. The book is called 70 times 7. It's written by Alex Marr, M like mother, A-R. And it's about just a terrible murder of a really lovely elderly woman who was murdered by a small group of young girls, young teenagers. And one of those girls was sentenced to death. One of her woman's family members, one of her grandsons, came to a revelation that his grandmother would not have wanted the girl to be executed. And so he becomes vocal about this. It enrages the community. It enrages his family. Ultimately, he finds that some members of his family actually agree with him. And it is the story of the girl's experience, his experience, and also the backdrop of the criminal justice system, because the legality of the death penalty for minors and the question of life sentences without parole for minors was under discussion throughout this whole time. So not only is this an interesting and careful look at the full circumstances of the girl, her family, her early life, the elderly woman, the care she had shown to all of the people in her community, and then the grandson and his journey, the book is also brave enough to look at the grandson's unconscious motivations when he decided to forgive the girl and to make contact with her, in addition to doing work to challenge the death penalty. Some of the reckoning about him comes late enough in the book that I was already getting mad and yelling at the book, "What do you want from her?" before they dug into it. And it's so careful and compassionate and thoughtful. I just can't recommend it highly enough. And if you did want to talk about the case, this is the perfect place to find the information. Again, 70 times 7 by Alex Marr, highly recommended.
Well, thank you, Jane. Jane has a voice like warm honey sinking over you.
You could just listen.
She's very inviting, yes. And, just a great way to explain this case and go over it. I definitely want to read this book now.
Absolutely.
It's just such an issue with young people and life sentences and the death penalty. Even if they are guilty, like the case we just discussed, we don't feel he is guilty. But if a young person is guilty, do they need to be condemned for life? Do they need to be killed? It's just so much to think about with redemption and forgiveness and the criminal justice system.
Yeah, well, and I think it's more so in teenagers than adults.
Oh, absolutely.
How many of the teenagers that commit murders are redeemable in terms of being able to live in society?
Well, yeah, and why aren't we better at figuring out who is redeemable? Why don't we have more on this,
That was the other part of that.
We seem really primitive.
It'd be lovely to be able to determine who would be rehabilitated and who wouldn't be.
Oh, absolutely, because teenagers do stupid things. I really don't think that they're fully aware of what they're doing. They don't really understand in many ways. And although some of these teenagers do horrible things, I think there's just a lot to it. And then thinking about was it the grandson who wanted to forgive her and not have her get the death penalty? That's very interesting as well. So thank you, Jane. I will absolutely read that book, and I hope we will be able to talk about that soon. Because, Paula Cooper, who was the killer, her lawyers described her as a victim of abuse. She had attended 10 different schools by the time of the murder. She had a prior record as a runaway and for burglary. So what about her history led her to this? That has to be considered, I think. Although she certainly didn't seem like a good prisoner either, right? She attacked guards.
She hadn't been.
No.
She was felt to be the ringleader of that group of girls. She was in charge, basically.
Yeah.
Even when she was in prison, she attacked guards. After her arrest, had to be moved to a county jail, and she reportedly bragged about her crimes, said she'd do it again.
Right, so maybe she wasn't redeemable, but then does she need to get death? Just a lot of issues there.
Sure is.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt and Jane. And I just want to thank all of our listeners for coming here today. I'd also like to thank Mike McClellan for our music. We haven't thanked him in a while. And we'd like to wish all of you happy and peaceful holidays. Although we will be back with a couple more episodes before Christmas and Hanukkah. When does Hanukkah start this year? Do you know?
Good question.
Yeah, we should have to look into that. And a quick reminder, we have a premium option of TCB where you can get early, ad-free, and bonus shows. And thank you to all of you who have joined lately. It's been great. We do a bonus case each month. Sometimes we'll throw in a recap and a discussion of a true crime show that really hits us as well. We also send new subscribers a gift with a personalized thank you note. You can subscribe by going to tygrabber.com/subscribe. Maybe give it as a gift to someone in your family or a friend who likes true crime or enjoys our shows.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Other ways to help us out is to give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever it is that you listen. And of course, we enjoy getting emails and voicemails with your feedback and your case suggestions. If you have feedback or case suggestions for us to cover on an upcoming show, you can send us an email to truecrimebrewery@tygrabber.com. And voicemails can be recorded right on your browser or on your phone by clicking on the voicemail link on our website, tygrabber.com. There's also a link in our show notes below the episode as you're listening on your podcast app. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time at the Quiet End.
Yeah, we'll save some seats for you.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.